sent my old flame a video of me using a toy. My husband exposed it to my whole family. I don't know how to start this except by admitting that I've probably ruined my life. I've always been the kind of person who can own my mistakes, but this feels a little more heavy. This one just keeps playing on repeat in my head. The stupid choices I made, the chain reaction they caused, and the way it all blew up in my face. But before I even get to that part, I feel like I need to explain how I got here. Because I didn't wake up one morning and decide to throw away my marriage. It was something that built slowly. It was years in the making, and if I don't tell it from the beginning, it'll just sound like I'm some reckless, sex-obsessed woman who couldn't appreciate what she had. That's not who I am. Or at least that's not who I thought I was. I met my husband Dalton when I was 23, fresh out of university, and still figuring out what I wanted. We were introduced through a mutual friend at a birthday party. He wasn't the loudest in the room or the flashiest, but he was solid. He was just who he was, and I liked that about him. He had this quiet confidence about him, and he actually listened when I talked instead of waiting for his turn to speak. We started dating soon after. He wasn't the type to blow up my phone with messages, but he always showed up. If he said he'd be there at 7, he was there at 7. If I had a bad day, he always went out of his way with the little things to make me happy. It didn't take long for me to fall for him. The first couple of months were this amazing blur. We'd go on long walks, cook together, binge shows, all of it. He was affectionate in public, not in a performative way, but enough that I felt wanted. Everything was clicking so well that by the time I spent the night at his place for the first time, I was already half convinced this was the man I was going to marry. But then that night came and we had sex for the first time. It was bad. There's no nice way to put it. Not nervous first time bad, or we need to learn each other's bodies bad. It was straight up awkward and clumsy and very unsatisfying. He wasn't a virgin, but he also didn't seem to have much experience beyond the basics, and even those basics weren't really doing much. He didn't really touch me the way I liked. He rushed through things, and when it was over, he just kind of rolled over like it was no big deal, like he'd had the time of his life and just expected that I did too. I remember lying there staring at the ceiling and feeling my heart sinking. Because here's the thing, sex has always mattered to me. I've never been ashamed about it. In fact, I've always been open about exploring my body and trying new things. I loved figuring out what I like. My first boyfriend introduced me to toys and self-pleasure, and from there I went down my own path of learning. I'd had flings that were purely physical, and relationships that only lasted as long as they did, because the sex was so good. I've never once felt like I had to apologize for wanting that part of life to be exciting. So lying next to him that first night, I couldn't ignore that it was a letdown. I was seriously disappointed. Like, sex isn't everything, but it's not nothing either. And I was left wondering if it was going to be a deal breaker for me and him. But by then I was already so far in with him emotionally, like completely invested and on my way to being in love. He was good to me in all the ways that mattered. He was kind, patient, super thoughtful. He made me feel cared for in a way I'd never experienced before. So I convinced myself that sex was something we could work on, that maybe he just needed more time and practice. That maybe if I communicated with him what I needed, he would adjust and change things. So I stayed. We kept dating, and eventually he proposed. The engagement was sweet and the wedding was beautiful. I walked down that aisle fully believing I was making the right choice. And for the most part, I wasn't wrong. Marriage with him was comfortable and great. We made a good team. We had our future planned out and we made a life for ourselves. On paper, it was everything I could have asked for, except for the bedroom. If I thought the first time we had sex was underwhelming, marriage only cemented that reality. It didn't get better while we were dating, and still I held on to this naive, delusional hope that he would put more effort in when we got married. In the beginning, I tried to guide him with gentle suggestions and small adjustments. I even initiated conversations about what I liked and what we could try out. But it never really clicked. He seemed embarrassed whenever I brought it up, like I was criticizing him or trying to embarrass him, so eventually I stopped pushing. But through it all, it always seemed like he was at least trying to make an effort, like trying to do the work so I could be more comfortable and happy. And then suddenly all that stopped. He stopped trying altogether. The amount of times we had sex took a nosedive. At first, it was like once a week. then once every 2 weeks, then it became normal to go a whole month without anything happening. It wasn't like he was cheating on me or even watching porn, and I know because I literally checked, trust me, he just seemed kind of uninterested, almost like sex was a chore he had been trying to do because of me but now didn't want to do it anymore. Meanwhile, I was in my 20s, then early 30s, with a body that still craved intimacy and sexual exploration. I missed being wanted. I missed feeling that rush of being with someone who couldn't keep their hands off me. It wasn't like Dalton never touched me, he did, but there was no urgency or passion. I tried to rationalize it. I told myself that he worked long hours and maybe the stress was killing his libido. Maybe it was just a phase, but the phase never ended. Months turned into years and sex went from rare to practically non-existent. We became one of those couples who had everything but intimacy. Like everything. It was all perfect except for the sex, and I can't even put into words how much that frustrated me. It wasn't like I stopped loving him. I didn't. I still do. But there was this gap that kept growing, and I just had no idea how to even begin to fill it. The longer we were married, the more obvious it became that our libidos just didn't match. He was fine with sex being this rare, quick thing that only happened in the spur of the moment. For him, it was enough. For me, it wasn't even close. I don't think he realized anything was wrong either. He could go weeks without touching me and not bat an eye. And when we did do it, he didn't notice that it was bad and that I was totally unsatisfied. He'd roll over, go to sleep, and wake up the next morning acting like everything was perfectly normal, and sometimes even act confused when I was all grumpy and snappy. I tried to tell myself I was overthinking it, that maybe this is what happens in long-term relationships, and that the spark just dies eventually. I tried to tell myself that I just needed to focus on the other good stuff, and there was plenty of good stuff. But I just couldn't shake the feeling that I was settling for less than I deserved in one of the most fundamental parts of a relationship. It was like we were eating every meal together, but I was still starving, if that makes any sense. And of course, the conflict stayed mostly in my head. Maybe that was the problem, honestly. That never fought him on it because outwardly, we looked fine. We still laughed at each other's jokes and cooked dinner together. But inwardly, I was confused and a bit unhappy. I was stuck between loving him and hating what was going on between us. That was when I gave in and bought toys again. It wasn't like I hadn't owned them before. I used to have a whole collection in my younger years, all sorts of sizes and shapes. My friends used to tease me about practically owning a toy shop in my bedside table. But then when we got serious, I threw them out. Partly because I thought we'd figure things out and I wouldn't need them, and partly because I knew how men can get about toys. Some of them tended to see it as competition or like they're being replaced, and I didn't want him to feel that way. But I was desperate. So one day, I ordered a couple of discreet packages and rebuilt my little collection, and it felt like a lifeline, honestly. When he fell asleep, I'd slip one out from the drawer and finish myself off quietly. Sometimes I'd do it during the day when I was home alone and not to be dramatic, but when I was done, it was like I could breathe again. It was ridiculous that I had to hide to take care of myself, but at least I had something. And for a while, it worked. It wasn't the same as having a partner who met my needs, but it dulled the growing resentment and frustration. I thought I'd figured out how to balance it. Keep my husband happy with the little he gave me and keep myself sane with the toys. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. Until the night that he caught me, it was late and I thought he was asleep. I had my toy out and I was already close to finishing when I felt movement beside me. I opened my eyes and saw him staring at me in the dark, like wide awake. And my stomach dropped, not in a good way. He just watched me for a while like he was confused, and then he turned the light on and asked me what the hell I was doing. I was embarrassed and tried to make up some excuse, but we could literally both still hear the vibrating. The damage was done. I didn't expect him to be happy about it, but I also didn't expect him to be totally insulted and offended. He went off about how I was mocking him and basically telling him that he wasn't man enough for me, which was ridiculous, and I snapped back because I just couldn't sit there and take it. So I told him the truth. I told him that I was unsatisfied, that he never touched me, and that when he did, I never came and barely enjoyed myself. I let him know that I couldn't keep pretending it was enough for me. The fight that followed was awful, our worst one. He accused me of emasculating him, and I accused him of neglecting me. Words flew out that we couldn't take back, and by the end of it, we were lying in the same bed, but we kind of felt miles apart. After that, things were all tense and uncomfortable. Pretty cold. He barely spoke to me unless it was necessary, and when he did, his words were sharp and almost rude. I thought maybe he'd come around and he'd apologize, because he should have apologized. That maybe we could at least have an honest conversation about fixing things. But he didn't. He was stubborn, and he sulked in silence, as if I'd committed some terrible crime against him. I walked around on eggshells in my own home because I didn't want to start anything. And the worst part was, even if he did apologize, even if we magically made up or something, the problem would still be there. The sex would still be bad. He'd still be uninterested, and I'd still be frustrated. I started to feel like I was trapped, and like there was genuinely no way out of the situation. So to cope, I threw myself into work. It was easier than sitting in that house, just waiting for him to pick a fight about something I did and make it all about him. I picked up extra hours and stayed late, and then I would eat dinner at my desk or at home when I was sure he was asleep. At least at work, I didn't feel like I was suffocating. But my escape would end up screwing me over too, because it was during one of my lunch breaks at some coffee shop nearby that I saw Jordan, my ex. I almost didn't recognize him at first. It had been years. But when he looked up and our eyes met, it was instant. He smiled at me, that same easy smile I remembered, and suddenly I was 20 again, back in our shitty little apartment getting drunk and constantly touching like we couldn't get enough of each other. He came up to me and was all like, "Wow, it's been forever." And I said the same thing. It was so strange to be speaking to him again and be standing so close. Because Jordan wasn't just an ex, he was the ex. The one I had really explored myself with. My first real boyfriend. He was the first man I had ever fully let loose with. Like no shame or insecurity. He taught me that sex was more than just an act, and that it could be a whole experience. We'd tried every position we could imagine, and we'd experimented with toys together. It was so freeing being with him. There was no pressure or judgment. We'd laugh in bed when something didn't work and go right back to trying something else. He had been open and curious. He never made me feel weird for wanting more or was put off by how much I wanted sex. With him, I totally felt alive and desired. Jordan made me feel seen in a way that no one else had ever come close to replicating, not even Dalton. So when I saw him again after all those years, all of that came rushing back. And it was like my body remembered even before my mind did, because I remember blushing like crazy and then scolding myself about how giddy those memories left me because I was married. I wasn't supposed to let my thoughts go there, but the harder I tried to push the images away, the stronger they came back. I couldn't stop thinking about his hands on me, and that was why, when he suggested we catch up, I was more than hesitant, but then I told myself there didn't have to be anything wrong with it. It had been years, and there was no harm in catching up on old times. I still had time left on my lunch break, so I agreed. We sat there together, and the minutes slipped away faster than I could track. It was like no time had passed at all. We laughed as we swapped stories, and we teased each other like we used to. For those few minutes, I wasn't the woman with a strange marriage and a secret stash of toys hidden under her bed, so her husband wouldn't find them. I was just me again. It wasn't until my watch beeped, reminding me that my break was over, that reality hit me. He walked me out, and before we parted ways, he asked for my number. I froze because I was torn between wanting to cling to that connection and reminding myself that I had to be careful because of my husband. Jordan had been the only ex who hadn't been left behind by my choice, the only one that I didn't dump. I had been head over heels in love with him when he ended things. He got this opportunity to take his art and photography across countries, like travel and create, and he had broken up with me and left me behind just like that. I'd even begged him to take me with him back then, but he'd said no. God, that breakup had taken me ages to heal from, and he was still the only what if in my mind, the one person I'd never truly gotten closure with. Eventually, I gave him my number. I told myself nothing bad could come of it. I didn't have feelings for him anymore. I was sure that he didn't have feelings for me, and I was married. The math was simple, and there was no danger in staying in touch with an old friend. That's how it started. It was just harmless little texts every other day and catching up on surface-level things. He would send me photos from his trips and all that. We would share playlists like we used to. Very basic stuff. Then came the occasional phone calls. We would talk on the phone for some minutes, maybe an hour, but it was never anything serious, so I never mentioned any of it to my husband. Things between us were still strained and distant. The last thing I wanted was another fight. Besides, it felt harmless enough at the time, until it wasn't. The texts turned into longer conversations and calls became more frequent. Soon we were meeting at the cafe on our lunch breaks and sitting across from each other and all that. He would talk about his projects, and I would talk about my work, and for that little slice of time, I really felt like myself again. And after, he would always walk me back. I didn't mention it at home. I couldn't. There was no way to explain without it sounding worse than it was. At least worse than I thought it was. I convinced myself I could handle it, and it was all under control. I told myself that I was strong enough to draw the line and never cross it. And I repeated that lie to myself until it became something that I genuinely thought was true. It was like this shield I could hide behind whenever I started to feel even a little bit of guilt. But the illusion shattered one night when we decided to grab drinks together. It was innocent on the surface. Just drinks. Just two old friends catching up outside of that same cafe for once. But the moment the alcohol loosened us up, the boundaries blurred. He leaned close when he laughed, and whenever my arm would brush his, I just wouldn't move it. Our knees touched under the table, and I didn't pull back. Every time his hand rested near mine, I felt this urge to hold his hand or play with his fingers. I felt things I hadn't let myself feel in years. I knew I was treading dangerous waters. I knew I was letting myself slide down a slope I might not be able to climb back from. But the problem was, I was so starved for touch and affection. Years of being unsatisfied and of being dismissed had left me practically aching and desperate. I was turned on beyond reason, and there was the one man who had always known how to make every part of me feel good. By the time the night ended, there wasn't much thought left, only instinct. We slipped into the back seat of his car like teenagers sneaking around, and the moment his hands were on me again, I forgot everything else. The guilt and my marriage, all of it faded away in that moment. We had sex right there. It was quick and messy and overwhelming. It honestly felt like my body had been set on fire or something. Years of Dalton trying his best and failing, and Jordan did it in a few minutes in the back of his cramped car. When it was over, I sat there shaking, not just from the release, but from the realization of what I'd done. I had betrayed my husband in a way I swore I never would, and deep down, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. I tried to keep things strictly friendly between Jordan and I after that, but it was like we both knew it wouldn't last long. Our second hangout after the car incident was at his place, and we ended up having sex again. Some of the best I've ever had in my life. It was after that I realized Jordan was something I couldn't just give up. After that night, I knew I was getting into something I would most likely regret. But I didn't care at the time. I was blinded by how amazing he made me feel. The affair became its own world, one I stepped into whenever I needed to breathe. Every excuse I had and every moment I could steal, I found myself around Jordan. We met after work sometimes. The bars that we would go to, and the drinks we would have as we tried to make conversation, felt kind of like a charade since we both knew what we wanted from each other. Sometimes we'd skip all the pretense and we'd go straight to his place or a hotel. We never went anywhere near the house. But it wasn't always rushed hookups. The nights where we booked hotel rooms were the best ones. We'd take our time with each other. Those nights were reserved for getting reacquainted with each other's bodies in every way. They weren't dates in the traditional sense. There were no flowers or candles, but they felt like something even more intoxicating. Hours spent in bed. I'd completely forgotten what it was like to have my body stretched and pushed to those kinds of limits. With him, it never felt like it was a duty or chore. It was just passion and desire. It felt like, with Jordan, I got to rediscover myself. A version of who I was before I settled into a marriage that had left me untouched for too long. The sex was everything I remembered and more. He hadn't lost the ability to make me feel like my body was the most important thing in the world. It was like nothing else mattered but me and my pleasure when I was underneath him. We used toys and positions that I hadn't dared to suggest at home. With him, I didn't have to suggest or coach in any way. He just knew, or maybe he remembered. He was creative and reckless in a way that made me feel like I'd been wasting years of my life with Dalton, which sounds awful, but I'm being honest. And every time I left him, I carried that glow back home, only to have it completely disappear when I saw my husband and was reminded of the reality of my situation and what I'd had to do to help myself. That was the worst part. Lying next to my husband after nights with Jordan was, to put it simply, uncomfortable. I would look at him sleeping and I would start to feel a little hollow. Sex with him had already been lacking, but now, compared to what I was getting from Jordan, it wasn't even in the same category. I hated the comparisons but couldn't stop making them. It was kind of unbearable because I still loved him so much. I didn't want to betray him, but it'd get like I'd had no choice in the end. And it wasn't only about the sex either. Jordan had always had this way of pulling me in with his energy, and when I was back under it, I realized how much I'd missed that too. He had this way about him. He was the kind of guy that made you feel special when you had his attention. He had this way of making you feel so seen and important. Of course, he only ever did that when he found you interesting. And the second he lost that interest, he was quick to ditch you. In a way that'll definitely leave you feeling shitty about yourself. Like he took all the good with him. It was why I knew I needed to be careful with him, but it was hard when I'd gotten so swept up. He made me feel like there were no consequences, and I fell right into it. One day, I came home and found a package waiting for me on the front step. There were butterflies in my stomach the second I saw it, because I knew before even opening it who it was from. The weight and the discreet label told me it was a toy from Jordan. For a moment, I let myself imagine it could have been from my husband. That maybe, somehow, he had finally decided to bridge the gap between us, and that this was his way of apologizing for how he reacted and trying to make an effort. But I knew better. That just wasn't him, and it never had been. This was from Jordan. And a part of me was upset by that truth, but another part, a bigger part, couldn't wait to tear it open. We had done this before, years ago when we were together the first time. He would send me gifts, sometimes lingerie, but mostly toys, and I would test them out alone and then with him. It had always been one of the most exciting parts of our relationship. Seeing that package on my doorstep reminded me of those days, and I was blinded by the sentiment. So much so that I didn't even realize how careless he'd been sending it to the house. I rushed upstairs with it after pushing every thought of my husband away. That familiar excitement of knowing that Jordan picked it out for me and wanted me to use it was such a rush. I almost felt lightheaded as I took it out of the box and felt it in my hands. I felt lost in the sensuality of it all, and then I made the mistake that would cost me everything. In a moment of impulsiveness, I decided to record myself. I positioned my phone, hit record, and just let go. I exaggerated every sound. I was calling his name and moaning about how I couldn't wait to see him again and feel him inside me. It was reckless and thrilling in a way I hadn't felt in years. By the time I was finished, I was breathless and shaking, and I sent the video to him without a second thought. I didn't realize until later that I had sent it to 2 people. Jordan called me almost immediately, and before I had time to spiral about what I'd done, I was caught up in his voice and the phone sex that happened between us. After that, I just sat there on the phone with him as we planned when we would see each other next. The danger of the mistake or what I'd done didn't register. Things with Jordan only grew from there. There were more meetups and more nights together. There were also more toys. It's just that we only ever used that at his place. I told him he couldn't send things to the house. I was completely caught up in this haze, and it kept me from even thinking past the next time we'd find ourselves tangled together. And it was kind of easy to do since things stayed the same and distance at home for weeks. That was until one night when my husband finally broke the silence. He apologized. Out of nowhere, he just came to me and said he didn't want the awkwardness between us anymore and asked if we could patch things up, especially with the family event that was coming. Every few months, both our families would come together for a little gathering. There'd be food, drinks, sometimes a movie. He wanted us to present as united and to smooth things over before everyone arrived. I agreed, partly out of guilt and partly out of habit. But inside, I was still conflicted. His apology didn't feel like it came from a place of wanting to truly fix things. It felt like obligation, much like our sex life. like he only cared because he didn't want his mother or his family to see cracks in the marriage. He'd always been a mama's boy and always quick to straighten up whenever she was involved. So, of course, he'd suddenly want to patch things up before she came around. I nodded, told him we could let it go, and part of me even meant it. But another part was angry that it had taken this long, and that he only seemed to care when an audience was involved. And underneath it all, I couldn't stop thinking about Jordan. I couldn't stop thinking about how impossible it would be to ever go back to normal after everything I had done. And the cruelest part was that I had no idea normal wasn't even an option anymore, because I had no idea that everything I'd done was about to detonate right in my face. The family gathering came quicker than I expected, but by the time it arrived, things between my husband and I seemed almost normal again. We hadn't fully resolved anything, but things had softened up. It was the first time in weeks that I felt like maybe I could still salvage what we had, even if it meant ignoring some of the broken parts of us. The day of the party came, and I felt so nervous walking in with him and being around family after all my nights with Jordan, but I told myself that things were already starting to get better, and that if we could survive the night, then maybe we were closer to getting back to normal than we both thought, and for a few hours, it really seemed like everything was going to work out. The house was buzzing with laughter, and everyone was moving from room to room with plates of food and drinks. It was an adults-only thing, so there were no children around. That way everyone could drink freely and not censor themselves. It was a familiar scene we had for the last few years, a blend of our families woven together. I moved among them and caught up with people and family that I hadn't seen in months. At first, the weight in my chest stayed put, but slowly it started to loosen up. Dalton stayed close by my side, and he even introduced me to one of his cousins I barely knew. He was super attentive in a way he hadn't been in a while. He was asking if I wanted a drink, and slipping his hand into mine as if nothing had ever been wrong. The calm and familiarity of it all had me reconsidering my relationship with Jordan. I started to wonder if being with him was really worth risking all of the people around me, specifically Dalton. We'd been in a really rough patch for a while, but I still loved him. It all left me very conflicted. At one point, we sat down together since everyone was getting ready for the movie. He leaned in, squeezed my hand, and whispered that he was excited because he was the one who had picked out the movie for the night. I almost rolled my eyes because I thought that he'd probably picked some sci-fi movie no one would like he'd done before. But then, as I watched him smile in that moment, I realized that this was the man I had promised my life to. Even with his flaws, and for all the ways he fell short in bed, for all the resentment I had let grow, he was still here. He was my husband, and he was still trying. The guilt I felt was terrible, and I told myself that that had to be the turning point. If I wanted any chance at saving our marriage, Jordan had to go. I decided then that I would end things with Jordan after that night. That whatever spark I had been chasing wasn't worth the damage it would cause if it was exposed. But then Dalton stood up. He walked toward the TV with the remote and told everyone that they wouldn't want to miss the beginning. I remember smiling and trying to guess what movie it could be in my head. The screen came on, and then my face appeared. At first, I didn't understand it. I was confused. Then came the unmistakable sound of my own voice moaning and calling out Jordan's name. The realization slammed into me like a brick wall. It was the video, the one I had made for Jordan. Practically everyone in the room gasped, and I felt sick when I remembered that I wasn't the only one watching. My family, his family, all of them were staring. It was absolutely mortifying hearing my moans through those speakers and knowing that everyone else could hear them too. I rushed to grab the remote from him, and then I turned it off. Everyone was staring at us. They were all understandably horrified. They'd just watched a video of me playing with myself and calling out another man's name. All I could do was drag him into the next room. I demanded to know how he'd gotten the video and why he'd played it for them. I was the one in the wrong, but I was also completely humiliated, so I kept on yelling. He remained unfazed. He was cold when he told me that he'd known about the affair, or at least that I was doing something less than matrimonial with Jordan for 2 whole weeks. He had seen the video too because in my haze I had accidentally sent it to him as well, before I could even beg or plead my case in any way. He said that he had spent those days making up his mind, and he'd finally decided that he wanted nothing to do with me anymore. This was his moment and his way of making sure that I felt even a bit of the humiliation I had put him through. I knew it was over and there was nothing that I could say, but I still tried beg him, and I told him that it was just about sex and that I didn't feel anything for Jordan, not the way I felt for and loved him. But he wasn't hearing it. He was disgusted, and he called me a whore and slut. He also told me he was glad I'd done it all. At least now he knew the truth of who I really was. Finally, he told me that divorce was the only option because couldn't bear to stay tied to a woman like me for another moment. Before I could gather myself and say anything, though, my aunt walked in. She too looked disgusted, and her voice was strained when she said that she thought it would be best if we both left to sort our problems away from everyone else. I wanted the ground to swallow me whole, but instead I followed as he walked out. He took the car without a second thought and left me stranded. I had to take a ride back to the house on my own. Sitting in that car, alone and embarrassed, I couldn't stop thinking about how my own parents had seen me like that. When I got back, I waited hours for him to show up, but he never did. The days that followed kind of blurred together. I called him over and over again. I sent messages. I begged for a chance to talk, but he didn't answer. The silence was worse than any fight could have been. My family, too, were strange around me. No one came right out and said it, but I knew they must have been ashamed and disappointed. The calls were short, and they always avoided actually talking about what happened, or even asking why it happened. Voices tense. Some of them didn't even bother pretending. They just chose to avoid me and what happened entirely. Like a week ago, I got desperate and I reached out to Jordan. I thought that at least he would still want me and still want to see me. But he was distant and just straight up told me that he couldn't keep seeing me because he had this art gig and was leaving the city. Essentially, it was over. He wasn't interested anymore, and he didn't waste any time cutting me off, just like he'd done last time. Once again, I was left behind. In the span of a few weeks, I had lost everything. My husband, my family's respect, the man I had risked everything for. I had chosen to chase after what I thought I was missing, and in the process, I destroyed everything that I had.